Hi, how's it going guys? I know this is a very different video to the kind of thing I usually make, but I felt like doing something a little bit different today, and I had been playing this game that I wanted to talk about. So, here goes. I, along with many other people I'm sure, have been playing Nier Automata recently. For those who don't know, Nier is an action RPG that focuses on a story of two forces of synthetic beings fighting over the remnants of Earth, one ostensibly fighting the humans and the others against them. Now, before I begin, the following are merely my opinions, and this game does have its strong points. Very strong, actually. It's narratively fantastic once you get past some small issues with dialogue and some kind of muddy characterizations at some points. It has a fantastic soundtrack as well. In my opinion, one of the best I've heard recently, actually. It's quite a bleak game, and the soundtrack really helps hammer that home. And so, you know, before we get going, I don't mean to imply that this is a bad game. It is, on the whole, a very passable game. It's just that it has some problems, and I'm going to speak about them. So, the above elements I've said are really good parts of the game, but games are more than these things, and even in a game that is often, and quite rightly, praised for its narrative and its storytelling, gameplay is still what makes a game fun to play. It's what will keep a player sticking around, working hard for that juicy story goodness, which is quite definitely on offer here. And Nier, well, Nier has just about functional gameplay, in that, well, I can press buttons and the game lets me get to the next bit if I do it right, but it never feels very fun. And I think I can lay out some reasons why I think that. Firstly, the game does play around with genre a bit. It often kind of switches between hack and slash style Meli Combat, which is the main thing, the thing you'll spend more than 90% of the time doing, and some sections with side-scrolling or on-rails shooting segments. Now, it's obvious that it's built around the Meli Combat part of the game. That's what you spend the most time doing, and it's obviously what the most effort was put into. But that's understandable. The problem is the almost flash game simplicity and repetitiveness of shooting sections. They feel kind of like an old 90s on-rails shooter, except without the charm or nuance or depth that those games have. And that isn't much of those things either, at least not in my opinion. They tend to boil down to endless waves of largely the same enemy, with the occasional larger enemy or change of pace mixed in. I suppose the reason of this is to remind you that it's a game and not a screensaver that you're playing. Many of these are simply solved by holding down the fire button and moving once or twice a minute. But that's just a minor thing, and if it was only those, I wouldn't bother making this video. So, let's get on to the main aspect of gameplay in the game. The Meli Combat. This is, well, it's fairly standard fare. You have two weapon slots and a moveset for each one. One light, fast attacks and the other slow, heavy attacks. The interesting thing here is, at least in my time in the game, heavy attacks haven't seemed to do enough more damage than the light attacks to quite justify their use very often. And you can mix up a little bit more than that. There's jumping combos, there's switching from light to heavy in the middle of a combo, and there's kind of some dash attacks and a few other little tricks you can do. The game does respond based on what you're doing at the time of your attack. There's also some shooting that you can do with your little kind of drone thing that follows you around, but its contribution to combat a lot of the time is fairly insubstantial compared to your own, and the majority of your own combat is going to revolve around those basic light and heavy combos. Now, you can add some abilities to that. There's a chip system in the game that involves buying and installing different software upgrades for your Android body, which all take up a quite limited amount of space you have for upgrades, so you're forced to choose which ones work best for your playstyle. And I actually really like that. It's a really nice system. Not only does it force strategic choice, but it's nicely worked into the game so it doesn't feel too gamey. The only problem with it is that, at least as far as my exploration went, the majority of these upgrades are just alterations to stats or adding or removing HUD elements. Now, the adding and removing HUD elements is interesting. It's good. That's a plus on the game, not a minus. But the problem is that not very many of these chips give you new abilities. One such rare instance is the ability to counter, which you can get in a chip. But there's not many other things. There's a few things like I think there's a shield ability and a few other basic things like that, but most of them are just stat alterations, at least that I found. It's possible there's a slew of them hiding in the corners of the world that I haven't found yet, but I did go looking, and I couldn't find all that many. There is, of course, the weapon slots, which I already mentioned, and you can swap out weapons, as you'd imagine. However, many of the weapons that I've tried, at least, don't alter much. Now, the weapons have a number of categories in the menu, but in actual practice, they'll either be a light or a heavy weapon, usually. So you'll be putting in one of those two slots. And, well, there's different categories of weapons, like there's some axes, there's swords, and there's spears, there's a few other kind of odd things as well. But within these broad categories of weapon, there's not a whole lot of variation in kind of weapon style. There's not a whole lot of variation in the movesets they use. They can be upgraded, and some of them differentiate themselves more than the others when they're upgraded, but not very by much. Very few of them upgrade in a path that involves anything more than stat differentiation. I would have liked it if they got more unique special attacks, but they don't seem to get a whole lot. A lot of different weapons that are swords, for example, which is what I've got the most experience with, have exactly the same attacks as each other. Exactly the same. Some of them have slightly different ones, but it's not enough variation to really make it feel like you're altering your playstyle. It's mainly a stats concern. And so, on to the actual fighting. We've talked about the stuff we use to fight, let's talk about the fighting. So, it's fun at first, but I find that once you get used to it, it devolves into a routine of attack, dodge, obvious enemy attack, and incidentally, dodging gives you a huge amount of invincibility frames, and then attack again. You can mix up some combos, just like above, and, it can add some variety to it, but there's never much need to do that. There's never much call to do it. And enemies, at least in close quarters combat, don't really require much variety. You can just attack, dodge, attack with pretty much everything, including bosses. And there's a few that are immune to shooting in certain circumstances. They have shields and things like that. And some that electrify themselves at certain incidences, so you've got to shoot them while they're doing that. But other than that, you can just attack, dodge, attack for almost everything. So that's quite simple. And this is where the problems start. Because as you progress in the game, you level up, gain stats, well, enemies level with you. And apart from some area-specific enemies that are quite interesting, I will admit, the variety of them is quite small, with most creatures just getting stat buffed as you level up. There are creatures added to areas as you level up, but they're usually just buffed versions of enemies you encountered at lower levels, in most cases at least. And the buffing is most notable in the amount of health they gain as the story progresses, which, as the combat in the quick early fights is already quite repetitive because it's just largely boils down to attack, dodge, attack, it becomes really quite difficult to handle when you're slowly whittling down a large health bar, not a small one, with attack, dodge, attack. And it can get quite boring. Added to this is the problem that there's not really many downsides to spamming attack. There's no real dodge mechanic to punish spamming of dodges. Yeah, I meant dodges, not attacks earlier, by the way. Yeah, you can just dodge to get out of any difficult situation. So it really ends up being as simple as wait in, spam combos, dodge when it gets hairy, and repeat until everything's dead. This is amusingly apt in its soullessness for a game focusing on machines and artificial intelligences. And the thing is, I was expecting to enjoy this a lot more because of how much people are praising it. People really like this game. And its narrative is great, as I've said before, but I was expecting its gameplay to hold up a lot more than it does. It really is quite surprising to me that I haven't heard a single person say to me that its combat gets repetitive as you play. I've even gone through Steam reviews to see what the feeling of most people was, and a lot of people praise its combat, and I don't understand. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's something I don't understand about it, but for me at least, it's very humdrum. And, you know, what the thing I'm surprised about is just how much I was expecting to enjoy it based on Jim Sterling's review of the game, because he had so much praise for it. He even called it historic. And I haven't gotten all of the way through the narrative, the story yet. I've done a gameplay cycle. I've played through it once, and I'm going to be doing the other playthroughs. So I'm not going to talk about its narrative. So far I'm enjoying it, but I can't comment as to its true quality yet because like there's multiple playthroughs that show you different aspects of the story, quite a few in fact, and people like Jim Sterling especially say that it really comes into its own in regards to the story as you play through more. And so far, even without getting to the point where apparently it brings out the big guns, I'm enjoying it, so I'd say that's good. But with these building blocks, no matter how much they scale things up, I can't see the combat getting better. And even if it doesn't fulfill my expectations, even if it does get better, then the problem then is, why make people trudge through so much samey, repetitious combat to get to the good bit? Why not work more on the early game? Because I imagine a lot of people are going to get to my position here and are going to have completed one playthrough, be enjoying the story, and be looking at it going, well, tell me I should play through again, but I'm just not sure I can spend that many hours spamming attack again. I'm just not sure that I'm ready for that. So yeah, essentially, the combat of this game comes across as Dark Souls, except without the consequences for making bad decisions, and with, especially at high levels, each fight drawn out into a tedious health bar draining exercise. The comparison to Dark Souls, at Nier's cost I might add, is quite tempting, as one of the reasons Dark Souls combat worked so well was not just the larger variety of movesets available to the player, and not just the harsh stamina restrictions that would make each and every move a very tactical one, and that rolling at the wrong time might get you killed. It's also that, at high levels, fights didn't descend into bored, trying to reduce enemies' health bar as quickly as possible frenzies. They were kind of hard and desperate and short. Win or loss, the fights were always very urgent. They had this kind of sense of urgency, and every second mattered. And it wasn't about running in and attacking really quickly, which is generally what Nier's about either. A lot of the time you hung back, but even with that more patient aspect to it, the fight still had urgency. It's a bit weird, the comparison, that Nier is very fast in its combat and Dark Souls is relatively slow. But it's Dark Souls that has a sense of urgency, whereas Nier has a sense of inevitability. And this is kind of drawing in on the problem I have with it, because that's really what it should have tried to do. It should have tried, not to emulate Dark Souls, but to make things matter more, to make tactics matter more. And in particular, that to not focus on adding a difficulty in the form of high-level enemies being massive health sponges, which acts less as difficulty and more of a player delaying tactic, which possibly hides another issue that one playthrough of the game, which is all a lot of people will do. I know there's more, but we have to go on. One playthrough is not going to be like an unusual circumstance. A lot of people will just drop out after one. It took me 18 hours and I was not rushing it. And that's not very long. And without this health sponge behavior, I really wonder how short it would have been.
I'm glad you're here.
So because of this, and because of the way it compares to Dark Souls, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Dark Souls. I'm going to explain why I liked the combat in that. Dark Souls is the only game for me where winning a fight against a tough opponent felt similar to sparring in judo, or maybe kickboxing, or your martial art of choice, let's say. It had the same thrill of challenge and of the urgency of every action. So those of you who have sparred or trained martial arts might know what I'm talking about. There's this kind of unique feeling, even in simulated combat in the real world, that very few games manage to emulate, and Dark Souls managed to do that. And it's because spamming really was not an option, whereas spamming in Nier seems to be the most efficient option. That really is a big part of the difference. And the actions had consequences. There was no get out of jail free card. You couldn't always roll away. You had to approach things carefully, whereas Nier, you can sit there with a load of attacks coming, and if you time it right, you can dodge every single one without even moving, because your dodge gives you nearly a full second of total invincibility, and this can be expanded with upgrades as well. So, while I put Dark Souls comparison being the most apt to being a real-world duel where every moment feels urgent and essential, and every decision you make is really crucial to how things will go out, and you don't just rush in and do the first thing that comes to mind, because you'll end up losing. Next to that comparison, the most apt comparison for Nier's combat I can think of is filling in a tax return. Visually confusing, repetitive, and I just want it to be over. Of course, that's just my opinion, and I'm sure many people enjoyed it. More power to them. But if you ask me, a better combat system would have given its story justice rather than dragging it down. I hope you found this enjoyable though, or thought-provoking, and I'd welcome you to leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm quite sure a lot of people disagree based on how popular this game is, and I like that kind of discussion. I'm sure many of you will have very interesting points to make. So if you disagree with me, tell me why I'm wrong. I might very well be wrong. It's just my opinion. And I'd like to see what difference in viewpoint makes other people find this combat enjoyable versus me finding it very spammy in particular. So for those of you who really think that this combat was executed well, I'd really love if you left a comment and told me your perspective. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you later.